think if we sort of look on the last decade, the tide has really gone out on us, and it has been going the other way for some time. And I think we can think of the financial crisis in 2008 as a failure of globalization. The banking system that was supposed to move the money all over the world, wasn't quite working the way it was advertised to be. And certainly, the immigration and trade debates have come back with incredible force in the last few years. And if there's always, the pro-globalization side always deals in incredible abstractions, in theory, how this stuff works perfectly, and then the sort of realistic Trump administration version is always to point out some of the very specific failings that we have to work on better. In theory, NATO is a great alliance in which everybody works for everybody else. In practice, the U.S. is spending something like 70% of the money, and the other countries aren't paying their share, even though our troops are all in Europe, and it's not like they're protecting the southern border from Mexico or anything like that. In theory, free trade means that you should have you shouldn't have big trade deficits because you should be exporting about as much as you're importing. And in fact, the trade theory suggests that the U.S. should have trade surpluses in a globalizing world because you'll be investing money in emerging market countries, which should grow faster as they converge. That's sort of how globalization works in theory. And this was actually how globalization worked in the 19th century. In 1900, Great Britain was the center of globalization, and it had a trade surplus of 2% of GDP, a current account surplus at 4% of GDP, and then the money got invested from Britain into faster growing countries like Argentina or Russia or things like that. And that whole thing didn't quite work out when World War I started, but that's in theory what it should look like. And instead, we have a world where the U.S. has massive trade deficits with China. We sort of export $100 billion a year to China, import $475 billion. And then the other side of that is the $375 billion gets sent from China to invest in the U.S. And so you have this really weird dynamic where the money is sort of flowing uphill from a fast-growing China into a slower-growing U.S. and an even slower-growing Japan and Western Europe. And that fact tells you that whatever the free trade theory says, what's actually happening is totally at odds with that. And then, then we can get into sort of very granular debates about intellectual property. Is it about tariffs that are different in countries? Is it about sort of all sorts of informal constraints on it? But immigration, trade, in theory, they're great. In practice, they're not working remotely the way they're advertised. And I think there are some very similar things one could say about other areas. Let me say, I sort of had this sense that the globalization story was running on fumes back in 2008 already, but probably the one place that I thought it was going to keep going no matter what was on the internet. The internet was this global communications channel. It had been designed to survive a nuclear war, and this could never be stopped. It could never be reversed. This was sort of a form of globalization that was unstoppable. And I think we may like that story, we may find it problematic, but the truth is that there are all these places where it seems to be going in reverse. And again, I think they were there for us to see for the last decade. It was just our ideologies that were blinding us. So China had a great firewall around it, and so the internet did not go to China. And it's had that firewall in place for well over a decade at this point. But people just sort of pretended that China didn't matter. It would eventually become more like the U.S., more like the Western world. It would eventually become a liberal democracy. So the fact that there was a giant firewall could be ignored. And there's sort of all sorts of things going up. In Europe, they just put in the GDPR regulations, which are sort of restraints on American internet companies from doing business in Europe as easily as they were before. And so the walls are going up even in Europe. It's again sort of suggesting that things are going in a direction very different from the way people thought. There was sort of a philosophical version of this globalization story that was encapsulated in a book in the early 1990s by Francis Fukuyama. It was called The End of History. History was over. It was, the world had become globalized, it had become homogenous. There were still like a few things that had to be worked out, but the basic ideas had been set. Everything was sort of set. It was going to be something like a social democratic, liberal democracy, sort of like maybe Western Europe, like the US. There'd be some small differences. Maybe you'd still have a 24-hour news cycle where people debated irrelevant stuff, but the big questions were all settled. I think that if you want to have a candidate for the biggest event of 2018, it happened in China, where President Xi was made president for life, and this is not the end of history. China is the biggest, has the largest population in the world, and this suggests that the end of history is definitively over. And for better and for worse, history has not come to an end. And so I think it's of course quite hard to know what all these things mean in practice, because the globalization narrative was a track. It was not just an individual track; it was a track for the whole world to go down. The track meant that you were supposed to move to a big city, to a big global city, because the future was going to be set in these cities. Washington, D.C., under the Bush-Clinton years, thought of itself as the city that was going to run the world. And so this is sort of why the globalization story was not just a story about the world, it was also a story about certain people who were going to get ahead in that world. If you were on the pro-globalization side, you were told, yes, you'd go to the big city, and then when you made it there, you got to run the world. Now, I think that story was never precisely true, since when you got to the big city, it turned out there were a lot of other people who'd been told that exact same story. And so it turned out to be a little bit more difficult. But it's not at all clear that any of this is happening anymore, and we need to sort of rethink all of this in a very fundamental way. I think the shift that's going to be happening is one from these idealistic globalist abstractions back towards a much more realistic assessment. If I had to make sort of one political prediction, and I know these are always very dangerous to make, I believe the next Democrat to become president of the United States will be someone who doesn't talk very much about Russia. And so it may not happen for quite a long time, but it's because we're not, most people in the United States understand that the Soviet Union no longer exists. They don't think that Russia is our friend, but it is not some sort of providential enemy. It's not the most important issue. In foreign policy, maybe China is more important, but certainly the shift has to be much more on domestic policy, on this question of what will you do to make life better for the average American, for the middle class in this country. And I think that's going to be the focus of this question. One of the sort of manifestations of globalization has been sort of a series of these bubbles, of these sort of consensus beliefs that everybody believe. And let me end with one particular one that I think is somewhat applicable for all of you here in this room. And I think one sort of dimension of the universal state, the universal world state, are the universities, which are supposed to provide sort of a universal education, a one-size-fits-all education for everybody. And they are not working the way they used to. We have an education bubble in this country. There's no single thing in this country that has gone where the costs have gone up more than the costs of college for the last 40 or 50 years. And it's sort of like the opposite of technology. Technology is something where you do more with less. And education has become something where we're doing less and less and spending more and more on it every year. So it's sort of like the most anti-technological sector in the U.S. in a certain way. And this is sort of this is something that I don't have a sort of precise answer, but this is something all of you need to think about really hard. My one strong piece of advice is don't believe the story that you're told. Don't believe that the tracks will take care of you, and don't take on any college debt at all if that's possible. Take on as little college debt as possible. think these debates in our society are sort of dominated by the baby boom generation who came of age in the late 1960s. Some of them are your parents, some of them are even a little bit older than your parents. And the thing to always understand is that the way they experience life is so different from the way we did. In the late 60s, college was free. It was actually a ticket to a better life because very few people went to college. It was a way to avoid the draft. And there were all sorts of reasons people went to college that made sense in the late 60s. It's not a formula for today. When I make these sort of anti-college comments, if you're talking to older people, they always think I'm completely crazy. And I could be talking to a socialist audience of young people. They would agree with me just as much as you do. It's a system that has sort of become a racket, and that simply is not working on so many different levels. The analogy that I've used is that that perhaps the universities today are as corrupt as the Catholic Church was 500 years ago. So if you sort of think about the eve of the Reformation, 1517, when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on the church door, on the eve of the Reformation, there were all these priests that did not do very much work in much the same way as college professors and administrators are today. There were sort of these indulgences you had to pay, much like you have to pay sort of runaway tuition. And it's also sort of a story of salvation because, if you get a college diploma, you will be saved. If you don't get one, you sort of will end up in a very bad place. And I think we need a sort of a reformation. I've often described the universities. They're sort of like the atheist church, and the atheist church isn't working anymore. It's not going to reform itself from within. The Reformation will come from without. I'm not going to try to start like some sort of alternative universal church. I think the much more difficult challenge is that you have to sort of figure a lot of this stuff out yourself. You have to think about it yourself, and that's hard, but it's also a lot better than not having any agency whatsoever. The future is in your hands. The good news and the bad news is that history is not over. It means some very bad things can happen in our world. It also means that you have the power to make good things happen in our world and in your lives starting in the years ahead. And I would encourage all of you to go forth and make history happen in a great way. Thank you very much.